Calvin Jones Huffman Lecture. Very pleased to present Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Ambassador John Limbert is going to introduce him. I'm Professor Ernie Tucker in the History Department. I'll just say that I knew Calvin Jones Huffman as a student. He was also my colleague, a very good friend of mine. And I'm very pleased that this lecture is to honor him. We have such a distinguished and wonderful guest to present. So I'll turn the floor over to Ambassador Limbert.
Thank you, Mr. Hampton. No, not for me. This is not for this. I'm very honored to introduce a very good friend and Foreign Service colleague, Ambassador Pickering. As you have probably seen from his biography, joined the U.S. Navy in 1957 as a photo interpreter officer. He joined the Foreign Service, U.S. Foreign Service, in 1959. He has served as ambassador to countries. I won't list all the countries, but a few of them include Israel, Jordan, El Salvador, Nigeria, Russia, India, the United Nations, all the easy places, places without problems. I think the only continent they did not serve on is Antarctica. Ambassador Pickering retired from the service in 2000. Had a 41-year career. Since that time, he has devoted much of his attention to the issue he's talking about tonight, the issue of U.S. and Iran. Where are we going? How can we, put it briefly, how can we avoid war? Some of you in this room may remember Ambassador Pickering from his session about almost exactly a year ago in New York, his exchange with the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Khazai. And what I saw from that, and the notes that people gave me, the write-up they gave me, I thought was absolutely fascinating, because people said, many of the students said things like this. They said, I always thought diplomacy was about people exchanging meaningless courtesies with each other. And what I learned was that diplomacy, in fact, is about respect and courtesy and real and hard differences. And that's what they witnessed. Well, please, I'm honored to present Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Tom.
Thank you, John, very much, and it's an honor and pleasure for me to be with you tonight. Thank you all for your work and interest in public service, where I spent a long career and where the satisfactions are preeminently personal. Don't count on making a lot of money out of any of this, but in the end, I have to tell you that the personal satisfactions far exceed whatever I believe one could expect to derive in terms of money. Thank you, too, for coming tonight. It must be a really dull day at the Naval Academy to get this size crowd out for a lecture of this sort. I want to speak about three things and then open the floor to your comments and questions, criticisms, and otherwise. I want to talk a little bit about the Iranian nuclear program, which is the centerpiece of our concerns. I want to speak some about the alternative strategies that are open to us in dealing with Iran, and then I want to describe for you something of what has already taken place in the nature of the agreement reached in November, and even more importantly, perhaps sketch out for you some of the tasks that have to be accomplished to reach agreement with Iran in the 6+ months ahead, under the rubric of seeking a comprehensive arrangement with Iran on the nuclear questions that are outstanding. All of this is against the backdrop of a volatile, rapidly changing, and highly unpredictable Middle East. And against the backdrop that while the United States has considered preeminently the nuclear question as the centerpiece of our interests in Iran at the present time, because failure there could result in the greatest danger to us and to our allies in the region, there are a whole host of other issues on the agenda which sooner rather than later will have to be addressed. Everything from cleanup of problems in the past, whether they're the Vincennes shoot-down of the Iranian civil airliner in 88, or the money left over from the Shah's demise, about which we have been haggling with each other expensively in The Hague for years, or whether it is deep concern that American policy toward Iran is really deeply disguised efforts at regime change, or whether there are a wide range of uncertainties between us over how we should be dealing with Syria, with Iraq, and with Afghanistan. And interestingly enough, the nuclear question, if successfully dealt with, can certainly morph in to these other issues. So far, the new Iranian administration has felt confident for perhaps the first time, accepting the idea that we ought to work jointly on the nuclear question and deal with that. In large measure, I think, because they are being hurt by sanctions. They are perhaps being hurt even more by economic mismanagement under former President Ahmadinejad, and they have serious uncertainties about where to go. The last election in Iran last summer produced on the first ballot a majority for one of the 6 approved candidates who ran on a platform of Iran needs to get back into the real world. It needs to find a way to advance economically. It needs to get the burden of sanctions off its back, and it needs to use its professed intent not to have a military nuclear program as the basis for agreement with the United States and others that we can move ahead. Iranian interest in nuclear questions began, as it did for many countries, in the days of the Shah before 1978, when one of the early results of our own nuclear development under President Eisenhower was seek a way to help countries acquire nuclear capacity for peaceful purposes as a way of guarding against and warding off proliferation. In some ways, it's been remarkably successful if you believe that President Kennedy was right when he predicted more than a dozen nuclear powers within 25 years, military nuclear powers within 25 years. On the other hand, we have had a creeping growth of proliferation, and certainly in recent years a very heavy focus on Iran and North Korea, preceded by India and Pakistan and Israel, and joining the 5 recognized nuclear powers who happen to be at the same time the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. The Shah began a program, a very grandiose one, spent a lot of money, had ideas about eventually acquiring 20 nuclear reactors to provide electrical power to Iran. That almost rapidly than anything else went away with the Iranian Revolution in 1978 and 1979, and the new theocratic, religiously oriented government dropped spending on it. Shortly thereafter, they were attacked by Iraq. There was a punishing 8-year war with very high casualty rates, including Iraqi use of chemical weapons against Iranian targets. And while the Iranians maintained that they did not seek to match and complement Iraqi chemical weapons use By the end of the war, they began to rekindle interest in their own nuclear program. And so through the 90s and into the first decade of this century, they began to develop nuclear capacity. The most difficult period is probably 1998 to 2003, a period which in part matches the time when they acquired from Pakistan through the famous Dr. A.Q. Khan, who was in fact the man who purloined centrifuge plans and knowledge from a uranium consortium in Europe and began a process of producing highly enriched uranium in Pakistan for their weapons program. And when in 1998 he sold a combination of used centrifuges, miscellaneous pieces, and perhaps rudimentary but not necessarily irrelevant plans for a primitive nuclear weapon, perhaps of Chinese design, to Iran, it certainly raised deep concerns in our part, in our friends and allies. By 2003, however, it is quite clear, probably because of our very successful military combat against Iraq, that Iran backed away from their efforts to develop a military program and slid back into what could best be called a program that was perhaps designed and operated to give them, through peaceful development efforts, the technology, the capacity, the human material necessary should they decide to move to a nuclear weapon, that they had enough of that in hand. And quite frankly, the Iranians have said from time to time all they seek on the one hand is to be sort of like Japan, which has most of these technologies but is not developing a nuclear weapon, and at the same time not make a decision to move that way. And since 2007, our intelligence community very consistently has reported to Congress and the American public that there is no Iranian decision to make a nuclear weapon. But there very clearly is an Iranian program to acquire increased technology and in some cases increased nuclear material to move in that direction. By the middle of this year, we were certainly very concerned about the fact that for 2 years the Iranians had been enriching uranium not just to the 3.5% level required for running power reactors, but to the 20% level, which interestingly enough had a use in the Iranian peaceful system in a reactor acquired by the Shah from the United States that produces medical isotopes principally for the treatment of cancer patients, but requires 20% material to operate. The reactor originally was sold to the Shah when it required 80% material. And over the years, working with, interestingly enough, France and Argentina, we were able to reduce the level to 20%. The Iranians, as part of what I would call frustration in the process of seeking a negotiated arrangement, reverted to producing their own 20% material when they ran out of the supply provided previously by Argentina for this reactor. And contrary to the doubts that many people had, were able to develop at least some primitive fuel rods for that reactor to make it operate. Negotiations had been going on with Iran for a decade and a half, principally conducted in the early period by 3 Europeans, France, the UK, and Germany, and then joined by Russia and China, but with the United States a non-participant, but basically the principal decider of what negotiating positions would be acceptable and not acceptable to the others. And so we were not at the table until the last days of the George Bush administration, but we were the principal player in the negotiation behind the scenes. The negotiations attempted to find ways to restrict and constrain the Iraqi peaceful program to the point where it was not only relevant to justified peaceful uses, but also where we could begin to enlarge the amount of time it might take the Iranians, should they make a decision to move to a nuclear weapon, actually to create a weapon. And perhaps in the middle of the late last year, depending upon who was estimating, the Iranians might be as close as 6 weeks to producing a sufficient amount of highly enriched material to be able to fuel a nuclear weapon. But we need to be very careful with these estimates, because even with a single significant quantity of nuclear material for a single weapon, it didn't mean that you necessarily had the weapon itself in hand with all of the technology required. Perhaps you could achieve a simple explosion through very primitive means, but to have something that was more than a nuclear device would probably require more time. Some have estimated maybe up to a year. And to take a deliverable weapon and make it in a sophisticated way capable of being delivered by a missile delivery vehicle with additional miniaturization and with additional testing might take another year and a view of some 2. So even though one could talk about Iran being on the verge of having a primitive explosive device, a military capability was less apparent. But there were deep concerns that once you had attained a significant quantity, in this case of uranium-235, your ability to hide that and keep it from being destroyed by military action was significant. Going in to Iranian elections, several things occurred which were very significant. One, we went through a period of examination, in large measure, in my view, impelled by some of the deeper concerns coming out of our engagement in Iraq as to whether we made a right decision and whether, in fact, a military action was the answer to whatever problem people felt they could postulate as having to solve in Iraq. And I leave that question for another lecture. But I think it was important to note that the best analyses of military capability against the Iranian program were probably that an all-out U.S.-led effort of a sustained character had the capability of setting the Iranian program back perhaps for a maximum of 4 years. And because of military differences in capability, the Israelis acting alone probably had the capability in a maximum sense of setting things back 2 years. And so it became fairly clear that there was not, put it this way, a single conclusive military answer to the Iranian program. At the same time, we were engaged in sanctions. And sanctions have had 2 objectives, never completely reconciled and still at issue in the United States. One was to compel the Iranians to negotiate and be more forthcoming in negotiation, and that seems to have been reasonably effective. The other, hoped for particularly by the regime change advocates, was that sufficient squeezing over a long time by sanctions would produce an Iranian positive answer to all of our heart's desires, like a ripe apple dropping from a tree. Certainly, for those of us who believe in realism in foreign policy, close to a dream world option if we ever saw one. Nevertheless, sanctions have had an effect. And interestingly enough, while negotiations continue after the end of the Bush administration and through the Obama administration, and the United States became an active participant, the process of negotiations and the progress in negotiations was very sporadic and pretty unrewarding. We spent a lot of time arguing about when to meet and where to meet. And then meetings would be held for a day. And one side would make a proposal and the other side would reject it. And we'd go back and negotiate for 6 months as to where to meet again. Not something that had great promise as a diplomatic process. But over a period of time, people began to look at 2 or 3 things that I think have helped to bear fruit. One is we became aware of the fact that as a negotiating objective, getting the Iranians to give up totally enrichment was likely to fail, but that we might have a prospect of creating a situation where we could negotiate a firewall both around enrichment and other parts of their program where we could extend significantly the breakout time. And that became more and more realistic as a negotiating proposition. Secondly, with no publicity and in complete confidentiality, about a year ago, through the good offices of Oman, which had enjoyed and continues to enjoy good relations with Tehran and with the United States, quiet bilateral conversations between the United States and Iran in Oman and elsewhere began to develop what I would call negotiating answers to the problem. And through a series of those meetings, some even preceding the Iranian elections, which also changed in many ways political attitudes in Iran, a process began of giving some reality and some life to negotiating possibilities. In the summer, late summer of 2013, the Iranians went to elect a new president. As I said, the supreme leader of Iran allowed 6 candidates to run, one of whom was Mullah Rouhani, who began to advocate quite adventuresomely in Iran a much more open, participatory, changed, reform-oriented platform. Many people gave him little chance to win. And to some extent, one saw the galvanizing of the Iranian electorate around Rouhani perhaps only in the last 48 hours before the election. In some way, through the operation of the Iranian grapevine, and through, in some way, a realization that more and more people were going to vote for him, so he had a chance. He emerged in the first round of an election with slightly over 50% of the vote, something which, in the great Iranian tradition of managed elections, the supreme leader could have jiggered downward had he wanted, to something less than 50% and sought to push a runoff. He decided not to. I think in part because they had made a similar mistake in the opposite direction some 5 years before in Ahmadinejad's second election, and they had 2 million people for a while on the streets in Tehran protesting. Rouhani won. He came forward with a changed platform. He indeed adopted an approach which was basically, let's see what we can get if we can in fact move in a direction which the United States and others say they want to go. We have a theological political edict, a fatwa, against nuclear weapons. Let's use that as the basis for moving down the road. And let us see, in fact, if we can, as a result, begin to produce some positive changes in the Iranian domestic situation, particularly in the economy, by getting some of the sanctions lifted. The end result was something called the Joint Plan of Action, partly negotiated by the U.S. behind the scenes, then collectively negotiated by the 5 countries plus the U.S. that I had mentioned earlier directly with the Iranians, which in many ways was far above in its positive nature with respect to our interests than anything that I think anyone who had followed Iran would have been willing to take a bet on even 45 days before, and where we gave much less in the way of sanctions. Principally, Iran agreed to stop enriching to 20%. They agreed over 6 months, in fact, to liquidate their stockpile of 20% material, either by diluting it back down to 3.5% or by putting it into a form where it could not be easily moved to higher enriched material. They agreed, in effect, to freeze work they were doing on a heavy water reactor, which was ideal for the production of plutonium, the second route to a nuclear weapon, and where they had agreed to expand and extend inspections by the United Nations. And so, in an unparalleled basis, the UN was given access to all Iranian nuclear facilities that had been subject to inspection on a daily basis as opposed to weekly and monthly, in addition to the constant surveillance of those facilities by cameras and by other technical reporting means. Added to the inspection task were Iranian facilities producing centrifuges and centrifuge parts, something that no other country was subjected to. And in addition to that, upstream facilities producing uranium from uranium mining, as well as milling and prior preparation facilities before enrichment for uranium, were put under inspection. And so we got a long way down the road, and with some significant restrictions. Iran is allowed to produce more low-enriched uranium, but at the end of the 6 months, they can have no more in stock than they started with at the beginning of the 6 months period, which began on January 20th, 2014. Part of this arrangement was an agreement to take a look at a comprehensive settlement of the nuclear question. And talks began on that on Tuesday. And interestingly enough, while the International Atomic Energy Agency reported yesterday that Iran still has more activities to complete to put itself at this stage in full compliance with the Joint Plan of Action, the meeting that took place on the 18th and on the 19th in Geneva for a comprehensive agreement ended up in a full agreement on all of the subjects that had to be negotiated, as well as full agreement apparently on a plan for negotiation, something far beyond what, again, I would have expected at these early stages, and a good sign. What is it that we're looking for in a comprehensive agreement? My sense is that we should try to open up the breakout period from the present now probably 3 months under the Joint Plan of Action to 6 months or 9 months or beyond. That there are 5 major subject issues which have to be addressed. One, and most important, is what to do about Iran's continued ability to enrich uranium. Iran, as a result of the first agreement, is committed not to enrich material in higher than a level of 5% in the U-235, the fissile isotope. And now there needs to, and not to exceed its present stockpile. Iran now has probably 18 or 19,000 centrifuges, 11,000 of which are operating or can operate in a cascade, and it has 8,000 of these of a modified and improved variety. And the effort will be to reach an agreement, in my view, on how much low-enriched uranium Iran will be allowed to produce and keep in stock for the foreseeable future related to its civilian needs. There are disputes about its civilian needs. Certainly some of them relate to fuel for the cancer fighting material producing reactor. But the agreement is in fact that we will provide that material in lieu of their stopping production of 20%. They have a Russian reactor, but the Russians don't sell reactors without two very important non-proliferation commitments. One, they provide all of the new fuel, and two, they take back all of the spent fuel, which contains plutonium, as a byproduct of the use of the uranium fuel for production of electrical power. Iran has, as far as we know, no capacity to engage in the fairly complicated chemical process of separating plutonium. But nevertheless, the Russians have taken care of any needs for fuel for that reactor for a 10-year period. There is at least some Iranian interest in having a stock of low-enriched fuel in the event the Russians renege on their commitments. A little bit far out, but not totally implausible. The second question is the plutonium reactor, and here a number of suggestions have been made, but one of the most useful one appears to be a suggestion that that reactor be converted to using a low-enriched fuel which reduces its capacity to produce useful plutonium, and perhaps then also take the plutonium in the spent fuel out of Iran once it's produced. A third set of activities has to do with continued questions from the period 1998 to 2003. What activities did Iran undertake in that period looking toward a nuclear weapon? And we know, in fact, that there were probably several. One were probably high explosive tests necessary for successful implosion, crushing the fissile material spheres in the nuclear weapon to produce the chain reaction. And the second probably having to do with initiators. That is, the use of special materials, principally polonium, in the centers of the spheres that can produce the neutron flux necessary with the implosion to get a sure fissile chain reaction. Both of these, there are signs they engaged in, and the International Atomic Energy Agency would in fact like to know so that it can calibrate and indeed continue its inspection activities on light of that information in a way best configured to guard against any restarting of those particular processes, and as a result continue to cut down on breakout time. The fourth set of issues is what additional inspections the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, would require to assure that the kind of comprehensive agreement that might be in play can be effectively monitored and verified, and any violations be detected very early, which again extends breakout time. And the fifth is a very difficult problem for us. How and in what way do we put on the table relaxation of sanctions as a result of expected progress step by step in improvements in circumscribing and containing the Iranian nuclear program? Both what do we do and how do we move? And this might seem unusually easy, but for 30 years we've had some sanctions on Iran. A number of those have been on issues that have nothing to do with nuclear, but they're commingled with the nuclear sanctions, and they're jointly justified. We have in the Congress a very strong feeling impelled by Israel's deep concerns that rather than take off any sanctions under any circumstances, we ought to be engaged in increasing the sanctions. After all, the reasoning goes that if sanctions helped us get to negotiations, maybe more sanctions would be even more helpful in getting negotiations in a direction further in which we would like to go. So those are questions that remain out there. Final point, there are people who are still doubtful about the success of negotiations, including many who have been intimately involved in the in looking at the Iranian program. The best arguments that they have been able to put on the table now to support their pessimism about negotiations are probably one or two. You can't trust the Iranians. They never tell the truth. They always lie. They always drag out negotiations, and they never keep any commitment they've ever made. I'm not sure, in fact, that that would pass muster in a good court, but that's their view. The second is that we really ought to be deeply concerned by an Iranian clandestine program. By definition, one we have never seen. Maybe by definition, one we can never see, which may be working away now to produce all the things that we seek to limit, and in the end arrive at a clandestinely produced nuclear weapon. The difficulty with that is that the two major facilities the Iranians started without declaring, clandestinely if you wish, were known by us and by our intelligence 2 years before they were ever declared, and have not escaped notice. The other interesting facet, it's a little more complicated, but if you have a limited number of technically adept people running very complicated centrifuge uranium enrichment operations, and they indeed are, the hardest aspect of uranium enrichment with centrifuges is not to make the centrifuge, although that's very hard, but to make centrifuges operate together in cascades of 160 centrifuges in order to move material from one to the other with the small upgrades in enrichment values that you achieve over a long period of time without crashes. And if there are a limited number of people engaged in this, and we are able to follow personalities very closely in Iran through intelligence collection, any movements from the declared open program to the clandestine program would be telltales. And that probably has to be read out of the picture. And that means that if you want a truly black program, you would have to start 20 years ago training the technicians to be totally isolated in moving ahead. So while there is no perfect answer to the postulate of a clandestine program, there is reasonable experience, and two things work in our favor. One is that they are not absolutely capable of calculating our intelligence capabilities. Even with recent revelations, we have a kind of envelope of ambiguity in our favor with respect to our intelligence capabilities. And secondly, they have to count on our capacity, if they violate agreements, to use military force. And they very clearly don't want that. They very clearly see that as a very serious danger for them. So we have those operating against it. And while there is nothing that's 100% sure in life, love, or diplomacy, we have, I think, an extremely good shot at a negotiating prospect with Iran that has now begun the second stage fairly well. I leave that there and say only go back to my opening words and remember, the nuclear program is very important. Curbing it is very significant. There are ways to do that, we understand. It is not a perfect answer, but it's an extremely helpful one. But we have much else to do on the negotiating agenda if, in fact, we are going to see significant improvements with Iran and in the region. And we already have, I think, very serious problems with countries like Israel and with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states who see themselves locked, if I could put it this way, in a competition, if I could put it this way, for U.S. interests in them and their activities, and see our role with Iran as potentially a zero-sum game for them. We have our work cut out for us, and obviously putting all of that in much clearer perspective than they currently see it. But it is a part of the problem of dealing with the changing situation in the region. Finally, any improvement in one place or another, I think, can help in dealing with the outstanding problems. So if we can make progress with Israel-Palestine, if we can make progress with Iraq, if we can make progress in Syria, that will help. Similarly, if we can make progress with Iran, it will help but not solve the other issues. The area remains obviously conflicted, very difficult, and very uncertain, but we are now engaged in many of these areas in an effort to see where diplomacy can take us. Diplomacy works effectively if you have leverage. A principal point of our leverage is, of course, the fact that we remain preeminently a military power of great significance in that area. But it is also, and I sketched out for you in some of these areas, there are also other areas of leverage that play in our favor, including seemingly an Iranian public that wants change, seemingly an Iranian leadership that is prepared to try it, and seemingly an approach with others that could find its way through the thicket. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for being here, and I look forward to your questions.
Questions, please. Please identify yourself. Right here in the middle.
This is third class voice, sir.
Could you stand up so
Yes, absolutely. Towards the end of your discussion, you started talking about a military response. Have we been having transitional red lines? And if so, would you be able to talk about what they have been?
I think that the President has made very clear over the last 2 years that he would respond to a decision by Iran to manufacture a nuclear weapon. He's had differences with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, who has postulated what I would call a less precise formulation, that Iran should not develop, quote, nuclear capacity. Well, to some extent, Iran already has nuclear capacity, so when do we strike? Secondly, there are real limitations, obviously, on a strike, and I think they multiply internationally were we to conduct a strike without having Iran pass the kind of clear red line that the President has tried to put on the table and which your question postulates. I think that's where we are, and I think that over a period of time, the Israelis have sort of pulled back from that and begun to focus their attention much more on what they would like to see in the agreement. Here we still have serious disagreements because the Israelis would like zero enrichment. In fact, they'd like full dismantling of the Iranian program. The Iranians have gone into the current stage of negotiations by saying, in effect, that they were not prepared to destroy anything. But we are now looking at questions of mothballing, isolating, shutting down, and perhaps things like removing critical parts that might bridge the gap here between what is essentially Iranian nationalist hubris on this question on the one hand, and our own desires to build a much larger period of breakout time for us to react to and operate on.
Any questions? Over here, please.
Fourth class track now. You mentioned earlier, later in the presentation, that it was sort of a zero-sum game with balancing our interests and our Gulf neighbors like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states versus the Iranians. What's to prevent a breakdown in negotiation and forcing the Gulf states, wealthy with their oil money, from sort of seeming their only option is to build their own nuclear program and kicking off a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, especially with the Sunni-Shia divide and the fact that those guys have been locked in conflict for several thousand, or over 1,000 years?
I mean, I think it's a very good question. It's one that's plagued us for a long time. Certainly, we've all been worried that the results of Iran moving to a nuclear weapon would not be just threats against Israel and perhaps others in the region, but a real stimulation of a next round of nuclear proliferation. And the likely candidates would be countries like Saudi Arabia, perhaps Turkey, perhaps the UAE, less Egypt because of what is certainly the disruption taking place now in Egypt. Although 2 or 3 years ago, Egypt would have been a significant candidate as well. And we know over a period of time, each of those countries has had an interest one way or another, both in what's happening in the region in nuclear terms, and secondly, whether in fact they could become, should become, or might become candidates for acquiring a nuclear weapon. And so a second imperative in slowing down and stopping Iran is obviously the very problem you mentioned. Saudi Arabia is in a unique and interesting position because it's clear over the years that much of their funding to Pakistan, at times when Pakistan was in critical need of money, ostensibly for development, but obviously for purposes of funding their own nuclear program, put Saudi Arabia in a position to have great influence over the Pakistanis and their nuclear weapons. Whether that would result, if called, on a direct transfer of weapons from Pakistan to Saudi Arabia, or whether it would be done slightly more NATO-like, that Pakistan would deploy nuclear forces, either to Saudi Arabia or in support of Saudi Arabia, is at this stage only conjectural. We don't know. But it's not an impossibility, and certainly it's one we should guard against.
Question over there.
Sir, Chief First Class Wood. That question, kind of on the same subject. Do you see Iran as, I guess first up, do you think they're actually trying to make nuclear weapons? I mean, in your own opinion, do you think they've actually got nuclear weapons in their interest? And if so, would you see them as being more deterrent against other countries like Israel, or for power projection?
I think that as of this stage and now, the Iranians are serious about not having made a decision to make nuclear weapons. If I would look at the issues that might be driving them in that direction, and may actually play a role in what I think they are doing, which is trying to acquire, as I said, the technology, the capability, the knowledge, the people, should they decide to go for a nuclear weapon, that they can get there, I think are the very things that you're concerned about. They live in a region where Pakistan, India, and Israel all exist. They have, of course, traditional enemies, and increasingly we see Sunni-Shia confrontation as involving Iran as the leading Shia state in the world, as a problem they have to contend with. They see certainly the United States in the region, and assume we use or have the capability of using deployed weapons. So all of these would be on the one side of the Supreme Leader's yellow pad, if I could put it that way, in the decision process of seeing whether he should go or not. On the other side, and we don't treat it as seriously as perhaps many Iranians do, is the religious prohibition against acquiring them. On the other side is the problems that have always come up once a state acquires nuclear weapons. Problem number one, what's it going to use it for? Problem number two, if I have it, I want nobody else anywhere in the world to have a nuclear weapon, because it downgrades the capability I might achieve in politics, if not in military power, from having a nuclear weapon. So at the moment, I believe we have an option that's open. And we have to use the negotiating option, I think, to put in place the best set of mechanisms we can to keep Iran as distant as possible from carrying out rapidly a nuclear weapons decision. And I think that's the best that we can offer now with respect to negotiating options, but I think it's an important way to proceed, and it's useful. And we've seen more flexibility in the last 4 months than we have in the last, 20 years.
Yes. Oh, let me go to the back. Let me go to the back. All right. Name.
Consuming fourth class raves. I just finished Kenneth Talk's book, Unthinkable, where he argues that the best way to deal with Iran is containment of a nuclear Iran. What is your opinion on the matter?
Containment is the code word for, in effect, accepting as inevitable that Iraq will have a nuclear weapon, and then using U.S. and other deterrence capability to seek always to prevent Iran from using a nuclear weapon. And I would say that the first part of that proposition is unnecessary. We don't have to relax, lie back, and enjoy a nuclear Iran. We have engaged ourselves for years in seeking ways to stop it before it comes about. And now we see the door open to it. Containment may be a policy of last resort should Iran get a weapon. But this administration's policy is to seek to prevent that, including by military means if necessary.
Question over here, please.
Third class breaker. Sir, in your opinion, how stable do you believe the Iranian government is, and what possible role would regime change have in negotiations?
I think that despite the fact that the government is unpopular in the eyes of many Iranians, there is not, in my view, sufficient evidence to believe that either the government will fall or the principal pillars of the government, including the Revolutionary Guard, will give way in the face of what seems to be a growing spirit among the public for change. And indeed, I think that one of the answers to that conundrum is for the present Iranian leadership to accept the Rouhani efforts at reform as a way of dealing with public aspirations, and that's not regime change. I also think that Iranians have shown enormous commitment and really deep fortitude in the face of attacks on them of one kind or another. And we need to be careful not to misjudge Iranian nationalism based on long years of civilization, a country brought together around a common language, and a country where there is a great deal of civic pride. And testing that from the outside is, in my view, a very serious mistake, because it then produces what I would call the defensive nationalist reactions that will operate totally against regime change. So if regime change is to come, and I doubt that it's just over the horizon, then it will come only through processes inside Iran itself. And the more that outsiders aid and abet those processes, the more that regime change becomes not made in Iran by the Iranian people, but made in America by the alternatives, by the others, by the enemy. And that, in my view, is a very unwise course of action to count on.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. First classification. Over the years, given our long and short political histories with Iran, what kind of indications have we given them, or as much as we don't trust them, what indications have we given them that we're negotiators in good faith when we come to them?
Not a lot yet, which is the reason why the present process is so important. Because there is, in a sense, a history of 33 years of mistrust fueled by misunderstanding. And so we're in the position now where a process has started, including these quiet bilateral conversations between the United States and Iran, where the test is very basically that we should promise what we can do and do what we promise. And we hold them to exactly the same standard. And they understand that. And so one of the values of a successful nuclear negotiation is indeed the fact that the implementation be as flawless as possible, precisely to deal with the question of trust and misunderstanding, which has gone way beyond anything that personal assurances can solve. Personal assurances are seen only as a basis for future mistrust, because they and we have seen them in the past. And so we have to begin in a fairly clean slate way to see if we can build up the kind of reliance on the negotiating process and its fulfillment and implementation to take us where we have to go.
Well, thank you very much.
You can't give a lecture at the Academy without receiving a photo album.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us.
Thank you.